Some years ago, I stood on the very spot where St. Augustine landed in England. There's a stone marking it. It's the Isle of Thanet. Nearby is the first purpose-built monastery that was constructed after the Reformation, dedicated to St. Augustine. The story is well known. St. Gregory the Great, seeing these blue-eyed, fair-haired slaves in the market on sale. Who are these? What are these? They are Angles. Angli sunt. Not Angli, but Angeli. They too must be evangelized. And he, with his own contemplative background, was aware that only a dense package would work. And so 40 hand-picked monks were sent, with Augustine himself, a monk at St. Andrew's on the Celian Hill at Rome, in one go, leaving around 596, arriving in 597, and landing there, sent therefore with authority and with the liturgical books necessary to carry on what was happening in Rome. Therefore, at the beginning, the monastic world was important. There was a Christian presence in the British Isles already, also heavily monastic, the Celtic form of things, but there had been a vast block in England itself. Augustine hit hard, got to the top, through the wife of King Ethelbert. And Ethelbert himself was eventually converted and was a great help. We notice the eventual cathedral built at Canterbury was dedicated to St. Peter, indicating the link with Rome. We have some of the correspondence between Pope Gregory and Augustine. We note he sent more things to help, liturgical books and the like. It is from the time of that same Pope that we have the Gregorian sacramentary. We also have the expression Gregorian chant. He standardized things, and therefore that standard was coming to the British Isles. As time went on, its own liturgy evolved, but always basically Roman. The Sarum rite became the norm, but always with the Roman canon unchanged, and also, as it happens, used by the Celtic monks, because that is one thing that was always there in the West. The language, even in the Celtic Church, we know from manuscripts, was actually Latin for worship. The interesting part of it for us in the monastic world is the fact that it was so anchored in prayer, and that the rule of St. Benedict was so important. That would, to some extent, continue. We can see how important the Benedictines were over the centuries. Great figures like St. Bede, St. Boniface, the latter being able to combine action and contemplation, preaching and prayer in a big way. And the building of these great structures, St. Edward the Confessor, buried in the church that he caused to rise from nothing, Westminster Abbey. Pope Benedict wanted to visit and venerate the tomb of St. Edward the Confessor in that ancient cathedral, which was also a monastery. And when it came to bringing back the ancient Catholic worship in London with a dignified cathedral, they wanted to have something of that. And it was the project, we know that, of the reigning cardinal to have Benedictines praying in the cathedral, Westminster Cathedral. However, although plans were underway and Benedictines had already been brought from Downside to Ealing to have some kind of presence already in London, when it leaked out, the secular clergy wouldn't accept it, and so the project had to be abandoned, and it had to be a cathedral run by the canons as any other cathedral would be. But it's interesting, and indeed quite a few Benedictines have become bishops over the years. At one stage there were 2 Benedictines in the London area bishops. The choice of the Abbot of Ampleforth as head of the Catholic Church in England was interesting, and when he was consecrated bishop, a Thanksgiving ceremony took place that evening in Westminster Abbey, and Donald Bevernoe, noted musician, was there before the others to play the organ. He played it very well to accompany the chant of Vespers in Westminster Abbey. And he quietly said to somebody afterwards, "Yes, back again. I was there to welcome back my brethren to my own abbey." And there's a reason why he said that. It was Dom Sigebert Buckley, a monk of Westminster, who handed on the abbey succession rights, Benedictine rights of succession, a habit and continuous presence, as it were, to 2 young novices, and it was carried on in exile during persecution at Dieulouard, and hence it is the same family. When under instruction, that same Donald Bevernoe had to thrash out quite a few things, because I was always asking questions. One was the whole question of the East. I had been taught to read Greek by the Eastern Orthodox priest of Cardiff, and I was influenced by the liturgy and their spirituality. I'd been given material to read about them, actually by my Baptist Sunday school teacher, material by Timothy Ware, to become eventually Callistos Ware, a great writer. And he had to point out actually that the breakaway had been on their part. there was also the fact that my best friend was a High Anglican and the son of a High Anglican clergyman, the Vicar of Cardiff, and it was difficult to accept that what his father was doing with very Catholic ritual was actually null and void. And so Dom Rollins had to sort that one out, indicating how it had been looked into carefully by Leo XIII. Now that one was a big one, because there was family pressure to not go as far as Rome, but to remain in the Anglican Church if wanting to go from the Baptist one at all, because there were lots of vocations on my mother's side to the Anglican priesthood, and it was less extreme and more grounded in Welsh tradition as well. They're far more Welsh. They have, of course, all the old saints and all the old churches. And I think still to this day, in the Diocese of Bangor, the Welsh rule applies. You can't be ordained without being able to speak Welsh. And so it is that calmly I was able to distinguish between two things which are not always easy to distinguish between. They had beauty, order and decorum and high standards of education and preaching and worship, and therefore it would seem that they were under greater blessing. But it wasn't the point. Travelling around, I could see that in Europe it depended not at all on that. The ancient churches of the continent were still there and still doing the same thing. And it could be felt. The real absence was what I was finding in even a very beautiful Anglican celebration. The essence wasn't there. Years later, I was sitting in an old confessional in Tuscany. I was confessor to Abbadia San Salvatore, Cistercian monastery up the mountain, and they've been calling me ever since. But after one session, I happened to look at the date on the confessional, which was still used in the old way, the priest inside and the people on both sides, one after the other. And the date was 1696, still in use. And I thought, this is a witness. A witness of what? What was lost in the British Isles, generations down the line, after St. Augustine and his 40 monks had closely linked Canterbury with St. Peter's. The structure remained. The mitres remained on the heads of bishops. But were they bishops? And were the churches holding the presence they were meant to hold? All because one man had a problem. Henry wanted a male heir. There, in the old confessional, where grace had quietly, secretly flowed and healed since 1696, Henry hadn't interfered, and grace was still flowing as it always had, and where it was meant to, and in a way the Saviour meant it to, and not one man with a problem. Actually, when still about 13 or 14, I was studying the Book of Common Prayer because I had my great-grandmother's one. She was an Anglican. She used to teach catechism. I have it here actually, and I looked very, very careful at the 39 articles, and I could see exactly what was going on. Despite the structure being there, the articles were all bashing what was referred to as papism, and therefore the structure was holding not the Catholic essence, but the Protestant one. And I got to one passage which indicated to me that that was actually the case. Here it is. It's the instruction at the end of the order of the administration of the Lord's Supper, or Holy Communion, in the very centre of the Book of Common Prayer. Whereas it is ordained in this office for the administration of the Lord's Supper that the communicants should receive the same kneeling, which order is well meant, for a signification of our humble and grateful acknowledgement of the benefits of Christ therein given to all worthy receivers, and for the avoiding of such profanation and disorder in the Holy Communion as might otherwise ensue, yet lest the same kneeling should by any persons, either out of ignorance and infirmity, or out of malice and obstinacy, be misconstrued and depraved, it is hereby declared that thereby no adoration be intended, or ought to be done, either unto the sacramental bread or wine, thus bodily received, or unto any corporal presence of Christ's natural flesh and blood. For the sacramental bread and wine remain still in their very natural substances, and therefore may not be adored, for that were idolatry, to be abhorred of all faithful Christians. And the natural body and blood of our Saviour Christ are in heaven, and not here, it being against the truth of Christ's natural body to be at one time in more places than one. The vicar of Llandurog happened to be a friend. My brother lives in Llandurog, and one day I happened to be at a Welsh evening service there, not expecting him to celebrate the Eucharist that day, so I didn't stay for the Eucharist itself, but just for the first part of it. But I did notice in his sermon that he did say this, on talking about the ceremony. Dadir bara ar gwyn ddim yn troi yn gorff a gwaed Christ. The bread and wine do not turn into the body and blood of Christ. Those were his very words in the pulpit. And should another clergyman say something else, it wouldn't actually make any difference, because what one says doesn't change what one is. What does is what one is oneself, because only a priest has the power to make it happen. It's important to bear that in mind. And so it is that no matter what scandal this or that real priest might give, any priest who was sitting in that box built in 1696, hearing the confessions of others, was actually releasing them from sin, because only a priest can do that. And this was the difference. G.K. Chesterton was asked one day, why did he become a Catholic? He answered, to have my sins forgiven. And this is why the Catholic Church is the only safe port of call. It's only the Catholic Church that can actually assure salvation, insofar as it has the teaching and the grace. The teaching, if it's rejected, it still remains the teaching, and the rejection can lead to loss of the soul. If the sacraments are not well handled, grace also is rejected, and the soul will face the consequences. But the Catholic Church has the means, the safe means, the guarantee. Follow the teaching and receive the grace, and we can guarantee you are eternally safe. No other church can do that. And so we need clarity of vision and thought, and not arguments which argue about the wrong issue. I wrote this then after this session of confessions in the old confessional. Oh, healing in a box where knocks all hell to have a place behind faces never seen. Oh, ancient wood where stood neath this old smell the aeons held in poise, where flames had been. Oh, tears did spring again. Oh, pain oft heard to be in this sound lifted. Here moves all matters for all time. A little word adjusts eternity in whispers small. Oh, damned world, move on and pass calm by this cupboard of sealed woe, and go away to height of bliss, where peeps an ancient sky bid bend no more as once of yesterday. The tingles of old sin knew well, but took a while to smile at raging hell. The devil